Welcome, Your Eminence Dimitrios, Your Eminence Methodius, Your Excellency Ambassador of Greece, Mr. Chilas, Honorable Consul General, Mr. Orfanidis, Mr. and Mrs. Jaharis, the Jaharis family, dear President, Deans, board members, faculty, students, and honored guests. I would like to welcome you all to our inaugural celebration of the establishment of the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture at Hellenic College and Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology today. We have prepared a diverse and rich intellectual feast for all your senses, and we hope you enjoy the event. A few practicalities before we begin. Student helpers are posted throughout the room. They can be identified by their name tags. If you require any assistance during the program, please do not hesitate to contact them. In the likely event of a fire emergency, exits are located behind you and at the back of the stage at the two sides. There's also a splendid icon exhibition by Fotis Kondoglu, which accompanies our opening festivities, and this is open to all our guests today from 3 p.m. to 8 p.m. It is located in the reading room of the Archbishop Iakovos Library, and it will be open for a further month starting Monday, October 4th. Details are in the brochures you will all have received. And if you would like to be on our mailing list for future events and activities, please do complete your contact details and hand in your form to any student helper. So without further ado, I will go on to our inaugural address. His Eminence, Archbishop Dimitrios of America, requires no introduction really, as he has been serving our Orthodox Church and the academic community for more than 40 years in numerous capacities. It would take perhaps all evening to recount His Eminence's offices of ministry and academic accomplishments. An internationally renowned theologian, church statesman, and biblical scholar, His Eminence truly combines the qualities of the living Byzantine heritage. We are honored that His Eminence Archbishop Dimitrios, Primate of the Greek Orthodox Church in America and Chairman of the Board of Trustees at Hellenic College and Holy Cross, is presenting the inaugural address of the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture. Your Eminence.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kouroumalis, for your kind introduction. Your Eminence, Metropolitan Methodius of Boston, Mrs. Mary Jaharis, Mr. Michael Jaharis, and the members of the Jaharis family, Father President of Hellenic College Holy Cross School of Theology, and Deans of the School of Theology and of the College, Mr. Consul General of Greece in Boston, Madam Consul General of Cyprus in New York, Mr. Karas, President of Leadership 100, Mr. Kikis, President of the Faith Endowment, Ambassador Chilas, distinguished guests, Madam President of the Philoptochos, dear friends, faculty and students. This is a celebration marking the opening of the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture. We are here for a real celebration, for a very significant event. The Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Arts and Culture constitutes a reality with a tremendous potential for a development beyond ordinary expectations. The opening of the center is somehow occurs at a convergence, or rather constitutes a combination of 5 major factors. First, the center has the name of Mrs. Mary Jaharis. The name Jaharis is connected with a number of significant, important institutions and actions here in Boston, at this very place, with the New Testament chair and now the center, at Tufts University with state-of-the-art, terrific laboratory at the medical school, in New York with a really terrific contribution and creation of the galleries, or the Jaharis galleries in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston for classic and Byzantine exhibits. Another beautiful gift to the island of Mytilene at the native place of Mr. Jaharis, a home for aged people. Then they have been patrons for musical events, for symphonies, and they have been in any event, ecclesiastical or cultural, always contributing in one way or another. Mrs. Jaharis in particular has been involved in artistic and cultural events. She studied, after all, arts, and she was even, again, educated in decorative arts. Therefore, she is in her own field, especially with a tremendous commitment and work to artistic and cultural events, and therefore it's absolutely appropriate that the name of Mrs. Mary Jaharis is attached to this new institution, the Center for Byzantine Arts and Culture. It is therefore important that we have in the person of Mrs. Jaharis and the Jaharis family a first factor very positive and favorable for the new center. Second, the center is part of Hellenic College Holy Cross. This is perhaps, not perhaps, no doubt, the best place for such a center. It is the best place because Holy Cross serves Orthodoxy and Hellenism, which are at the heart of Byzantine arts and culture. And it would be no better place than this to create this new center. A center which will be in a very healthy and favorable environment. Sometimes you might have studies related to Byzantium, pardon me the expression, as orphans within a big number of fields, faculties, and actions in various universities. Here, this institute, this center, is going to be in conjunction with a number of homogeneous parallel things that help build the image of offering the best possible approach to understanding Byzantium. We have the Papa's Patristic Institute, we have the Cantonist Chair for Byzantine History, we have the Patristic Studies, so there is an environment that is extremely favorable for this center now that we inaugurate today. Third, a third factor, very again favorable, is the organization and structure of this center. It is something that is important, that you have a very flexible entity here, able to produce and promote things in a much easier way than in any other form. So the structure and the organization is important. There is a board of trustees comprising people who are very related to the field. You have in the person of Dr. Kouroumalis, who opened this session today, a very dynamic young scholar, very promising, who is very knowledgeable about the field. Furthermore, this flexibility of the center will be manifested also at the variety of the programs which the center will establish. Fourth factor, very positive, is the timing. We live in a period of time when there is a revival or an increased attention to the Byzantine entity, reality, let me use this expression, to mean culture, arts, history, theology, literature, science, and social life. So this is manifested through the increased number of publications about Byzantium. In our own community, in our church, we experience this phenomenon first by the increasing number of new churches built which are really of Byzantine rhythm. Sometimes people use the term Neo-Byzantine. Quite frankly, I don't know what the difference is. If something which is Neo-Byzantine is not a continuation of the Byzantine, why is Neo-Byzantine? Because it's beyond Byzantium in terms of historical time. Nonetheless, art is beyond time, and therefore these are specimens of a continuation, creative continuation of the Byzantine study. We have gone through a period when people had the illusion that they could build a box-like church, place a dome on top, and they call it Byzantine. That's not the case. I'm talking about churches that what could be very easily stand by excellent specimens of real Byzantine art throughout the world, especially in Greece and in contemporary Turkey. We have also the same phenomenon in the increasing interest in Byzantine music, especially among younger generation people. Sometimes we have something that is a phenomenon that happened in the past in Greece, especially in villages, when little children would go near the cantor and try to somehow start learning to chant in the church of the village. Now here we have a case when very young children now are interested in learning Byzantine music. I'm talking about elementary school children. And I have to add, girls. There is an increased number of young ladies that are willing, very much willing, that are engaging in learning the Byzantine chanter. So this is a fourth factor that is very favorable. I'm finishing with the fifth factor. The fifth has to do with the content and the perspective of activities that we are thinking that are going to be related and connected to this Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Arts and Culture. That means that this center will have a very open and large field. You have architecture, Byzantine architecture, you have Byzantine iconography, you have Byzantine literature, you have Byzantine theological literature, you have Byzantine music, you have Byzantine jewelry art, you have Byzantine art related to small artifacts and other items, especially connected with the worship of the church, is a huge field in which now this center could be open. And it will be open in various forms, like exhibitions, seminars, conferences, lectures, and even, God knows, with the development that will follow, even offering specific teachings and schools about Byzantine history, art, culture. By a coincidence, I'm going beyond what I have written, a gentleman yesterday, when I told him that we are here for the inaugural ceremony and festivities related to the center, he said, "Oh, where is going to be the building? I said, at this point, the center is located within the campus of Holy Cross Hellenic College, Holy Cross School of Theology, and just it shares some of the facilities there, the rooms. But I told him, there might be a day, not far away, when you might have a special building for the whole nexus and network of Byzantine studies, part of which, of course, central part of which will be the Mary Jaharis Center. Because you see, the idea of the people, as soon as they hear the word center, it's something that is of an institution related to something of a visible building there. We thank God for this new center. We thank the Jaharis family, and especially Mrs. Mary Jaharis for agreeing to give reluctantly her name to the new center. We have thanks for the school that hosts this center for Byzantine arts and culture. We are strongly believing that there is a very bright future for this new entity that is present in our campus here. And allow me to, at this moment, to do something which is contrary to my identity as biblical scholar, namely to use a passage from the Bible in the wrong way. But I'm going to do that because this passage is very expressive of something. So I'm really prefacing what I'm going to say with a clear indication that this has to be applied in a very, very remote analogy. But nonetheless, because it's very expressive, I thought it's worth mentioning. It is from the Gospel, this comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and it's among a series of parables which the Lord Jesus Christ used. So among them is the following. I'm reading it first in the original. Άλλην παραβολήν παρέθηκεν αυτής ο Ιησούς λέγον, ομοία εστίν η βασιλεία των ουρανών, κόκο συνάπεως. Ον λαβών άνθρωπος έσπηρεν εν το αγρό αυτού, ο μικρότερον μεν εστί πάντων των σπερμάτων, όταν δε αυξηθεί μείζον των λαχάνων εστίν και γίνεται δένδρον, ώστε ελθύν τα πετεινά του ουρανού και κατασκηνούν εν της κλάδης αυτού. Translated. Another parable Jesus put before his disciples, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. It is this small piece, is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. What we have here today is a grain of a mustard seed showed in the field of Hellenic College Holy Cross. This is today. What we expect tomorrow is a great tree displaying in many ways the splendor of the Byzantine arts and culture. Thank you for being part of this inaugural ceremony of joy, peace, and thankfulness.
I would now like to call the Reverend Father Nicholas Triandafilou, President of Hellenic College and Holy Cross, Greek Orthodox School of Theology, to give a brief briefing.
Beautiful job. Thank you. Your Eminence Archbishop Demetrius, Your Eminence Metropolitan Methodius, Mr. Michael and Mrs. Mary Jaharis and Jaharis family all, Honorable Mr. Orphanides, Ambassador Tsilas, Honorable Mrs. Sofianou, Mrs. Jaharis, National Philanthropist President, Dr. Kurumali, and Reverend Dr. Katsonis. Magnificent display. Thank you very, very much. Dear friends all, on behalf of all the past trustees of Hellenic College Holy Cross, presidents, deans, faculty, students, and staff, and all the present participants, it is my honor to extend to you, Mr. and Mrs. Jaharis, our enormous gratitude and in-depth love and respect for this very special and unprecedented gift and center. I rise to welcome you all here to this historic inaugural of the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture. Your initiatives, Mr. and Mrs. Jaharis, your creativity, your generosity, open most meaningful new horizons for Hellenic College and Holy Cross, for our Archdiocese, as well as for Christian Orthodoxy at large. Horizons that look to all the generations to come while embracing the generations of the past. These horizons, due to the vision of previous leaders of our church in America, to bring Hellenic College and Holy Cross, or Holy Cross at first and then Hellenic College, here into the Boston area, opens up areas through the Boston Theological Institute that previously could not have been addressed. So although the gift comes to one theological school in one college, because of the consortium that exists, we have immediate access to greater horizons than ever before. Please know, every member of our Hellenic College Holy Cross body will daily exercise her or his best to honor your trust and to respect your selfless philanthropy. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. I would now like to call the Reverend Dr. Thomas Fitzgerald, Professor of Church History and Historical Theology and Dean of Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, to give an address.
Your Eminence, Archbishop Demetrius, Your Eminence, Metropolitan Methodius, Mr. and Mrs. Jaharis, and distinguished guests here today. Mr. and Mrs. Jaharis, we welcome you once again to our campus, and we are deeply grateful for your generous contribution to our life. Our students, as well as the programs of our college and graduate school of theology, will benefit greatly from the establishment of this, the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture. One cannot study the many disciplines of Orthodox theology without an appreciation of the Byzantine world. And this is especially true for those of us who treasure our historic relationship with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Patriarchate which, even in times of oppression, continues to remind us of our rich Byzantine Christian heritage of piety, learning, and philanthropy. Within the context of the Byzantine world, the person of Jesus Christ and the significance of his gospel received profound attention and explication. Indeed, Jesus Christ is the essential key to understanding the Roman Byzantine world. The gospel is central to its phronema, its worldview. Our understanding of the breadth and the depth of Orthodox Christianity continues to be enriched by the fathers and mothers, the poets and mystics, the scholars and missionaries, the patrons and philanthropists, the iconographers, the musicians of the Byzantine world. Through their lives, their art, their literature, they remind us of the intimate relationship between virtue, piety, and philanthropy. The Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture will enable us to emphasize the significance of Byzantine studies, not only for our school, but also more generally for theological education today. Holy Cross is the only graduate school of theology in the Western world where Byzantine studies have a prominent and permanent part in theological education and formation. Again, we are deeply grateful for the establishment of this distinctive and very special center. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to call the Dean, Interim Dean of Hellenic College and Associate Professor of Religious Studies, Dr. Dimitrios Kaitis.
Beauty will save the world, Dostoevsky once prophesied, and this oft-quoted dictum has inspired many a modern philosopher to return to the nature of the beautiful, the good, and the true, that trinity of classical Greek philosophy. The stodgy professor in me would love to explore the power of that trinity to transform one's intellect and affect, but I will not, because I've been warned not to speak for more than 3 minutes, so time me. Indulge me, however, that I might reflect briefly upon a corollary that is apt for the current celebration, that beauty confirms the world is being saved. More than 12 centuries ago, Orthodox bishops affirmed this truth in a most startling way, having been summoned to a council in Nicaea by the great Empress Irene. Their assembly, recognized today as the Seventh Ecumenical Council, did not merely sanction art. It proclaimed that icons preach the reality of Christ's incarnation. In icons, wood and paint declare the glory of God, and their image arouses in the beholder a yearning for a promised, transfigured creation. Today, we have been summoned to reaffirm this truth by another extraordinary benefactress of the Church, Mrs. Mary Jaharis. A patron of the arts, possessed of vision for a world transformed by beauty, she has founded the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture to remind us all, so saturated with ephemeral digital images and burdened by the price we've paid for our materialism, that art and culture can make present the beautiful, the good, and the true. This center will study the myriad ways in which Byzantine society suffused Greek and Roman culture, its art and architecture, its literature and rhetoric, its pageantry and music, with a particular Christian imagination, and so advance the college's mission of infusing modern endeavors with divine spirit. More importantly, its inauguration today sounds a clarion call to this college to rediscover its roots in classical culture and Christian scripture, and to revive the Church's rich heritage in Christian humanism. Your Eminences, Mrs. Mary Jaharis, Mr. Michael Jaharis, members of the Board of Trustees, honored dignitaries and benefactors, distinguished speakers and performers, on behalf of the faculty and the students of Hellenic College, I welcome you to our lovely campus and to this splendid inaugural event. Be provoked by the lectures, be inspired by the music, and be transformed by your encounter with the sacred art of this singular exhibit of Byzantine-inspired icons. Please linger and return again and again, so that together we may marvel at the power of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to call Professor Margaret Mullett. Professor Mullett is the director of the Byzantine Study Center at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. She is a well-known Byzantine scholar who has written and researched widely on literacy, patronage, genre, gender, and friendship in Byzantine society. She has also edited several important publications on Byzantium and the classical tradition, 11th and 12th century monasticism, and her work on the letters of the Archbishop Theophylact of Ohrid is an exemplary study of Byzantine epistolography. Before taking up her position as director at DO, Professor Mullett was a senior lecturer at Queen's University Belfast, a visiting professor at the Institute for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies in Vienna, Austria, and has also lectured extensively throughout Europe and the United States. And we're very grateful to have her here today.
To move that a little bit. Your Eminences, Your Excellencies, Mrs. Jaharis, Mr. Jaharis, Dr. Kurmali, and colleagues. I'm delighted to be here on this auspicious occasion in the life of Hellenic College and Holy Cross, and to be able to see something at its birth, which I'm quite sure in future is going to grow to be a mainstay of Orthodoxy and Byzantine studies, and in particular the link between them in this country. Already this campus in its dual role, which is something that is slightly familiar for me in a different form from Ireland, is a beacon, a headquarters for Orthodox education in America. In that previous existence in Belfast, I was grateful for the support in liturgical studies for our work on an 11th century monastery. Indeed, the liturgical team, the very small liturgical team of our project, actually held a meeting here and felt very much welcome. But I would say, and I speak as a Byzantinist, of course, that no Byzantinist could fail to be grateful for what has been achieved here. The Greek Orthodox Theological Review, publications like The New Holistic Healing, but also the invaluable Archbishop Iakovos Library, which published translations of Byzantine texts when no one else would. When the doyenne of Penguin Classics, Betty Radici, exclaimed with horror, "Not another Byzantine saint's life." That is an impossible thought here. You welcomed those saints' lives. Great scholars published with you. The Shevchenkos, my predecessor at Dumbarton Oaks, Alice Mary Talbot, Angela Hero, Dennis Sullivan. And not just saints' lives were published, but miracle collections and letter collections and liturgical treatises and encomia. Generations of Byzantinists were caught for the subject because of this great publishing endeavour. And all this happened without the Mary Jaharis Centre. Think what more can now be achieved. I come from a research centre with a very different tradition, Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, where a couple with exquisite tastes in music, art, and gardens collected objects in their chosen fields, then the scholars to study them, then the books those scholars needed. Now that may be very different in ethos and history, but working there has taught me something that my work in Byzantine literature perhaps also should have done, to say nothing of my long years in growing a very small research institute in Belfast, that enlightened, generous, imaginative, truthful patronage is just as important as the brilliant scholarship or the possession of important objects or the composition of wonderful music or the exhibition of important paintings for the development of the subject, indeed underlies all these achievements. 10 years ago, I was fortunate to be invited by Helen Evans to speak at the Met and to spend time enjoying the Mary and Michael Jaharis galleries there, another wonderful act of patronage. So I think we should all be grateful, far beyond the doors of this institution, far from the Golden Dome, for this new initiative. To Mrs. Jaharis, to the administrative board that worked with her to set it all up. And in future, I look forward very much to working with Maria, whom I know from the UK and her great work there, and with Father Joachim, whose Byzantine figural crosses is a record of his contribution already to my institution, and who will be working with us in future on the seals collection. But I wish everyone well, and I wish them well on behalf of my institution as well. The musicians, the icon painters, the visiting scholars, the campus students. And I heard today very moving testimony of the impact on the students here in the exciting years that lie ahead in this new centre. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we move to the first lecture of the evening. I'd like to welcome Dr. Helen Evans. Dr. Helen Evans is a specialist in early Christian and Byzantine art and the Mary Michael Jaharis Curator for Byzantine Art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. She is best known as the curator of the Metropolitan Museum's two major Byzantine exhibitions, The Glory of Byzantium, Art and Culture of the Middle Byzantine Era in 1997, and Byzantium, Faith and Power in 2004. In 2000, she installed the Mary and Michael Jaharis Galleries of Byzantine Art at the Metropolitan Museum, the first galleries dedicated to Byzantine art in a major museum, and expanded these galleries in 2008. She has written numerous scholarly articles and co-authored catalogues for exhibitions she organized at the Metropolitan, as well as the Morgan Library, the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, the Benaki Museum in Athens, and the Foundation Pierre Giannada in Switzerland. Dr. Evans has taught at the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University, Columbia University, the University of Chicago, and Oberlin College, and has lectured extensively in Europe and America. Dr. Helen Evans also serves as a member of the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture Administrative Board here at Hellenic College and Holy Cross. She will be speaking to us about Byzantium and Kondoglu. Dr. Evans.
Thank you, Maria. Your Eminence, Archbishop Demetrius, Your Eminence, Archbishop Methodius, Mary Jaharis, the other members of the Jaharis family, and so many distinguished guests that I don't think you want it repeated again. Father Joachim has arranged a fascinating exhibit. Let's see if this works. Yes. On Fotios Kondoglu for the opening of the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture, and I do hope all of you will go to it before you leave this evening, because it's really a wonderful exhibition, and it is, as with this center itself, part of the newest expression of the growing interest in and exploration of Byzantine culture in America and abroad. It's most appropriate to open the center with an exhibition on Kondoglu, as approximately a century ago, he was one of the most important artists leading the revival of Byzantine studies in Greece. Born in Asia Minor, he attended school in Athens, studied in France, and then became a professor of art history, a painter, and a well-known author in Athens. In his formative years, Byzantine art was only beginning to be appreciated in Greece and abroad. He was a leader in his use of his concept of the Byzantine tradition in his own paintings, especially in his decoration of churches and his painting of icons, and a leader in promoting Byzantine art through his writings and teachings. Since the exhibition can only have portable icons, I am offering you a view of a Virgin and Child from one of the churches he decorated in Athens, and we will return to it at the end. What I would like to explore is how did Kondoglu's vision of Byzantium relate to others in his own time, because today we're celebrating a center that will explore Byzantine art and culture in relation to our time and to orthodoxy. Kondoglu would write, "Byzantine art is for me the art of arts. I believe in it as I believe in the Orthodox religion. Only this art nourishes my soul through its deep and mysterious power. In comparison with Byzantine art, all others appear to me trivial. But what was Kondoglu's Byzantine art, and what other concepts of Byzantium existed around him? The mosaics of the great church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople that are now illustrated in all textbooks on Byzantium were still covered with plaster when Kondoglu began painting in his Byzantine style in 1926. While their existence was known from restoration work done in the mid-19th century, the monumental 9th century image of the Virgin and Child that we all recognize on the screen from the apse of the great church would not be uncovered until the late 1930s as the Second World War began. The church's mosaics would be widely published and studied in the post-war years as exemplars of Byzantine culture, but that was late in Kondoglu's development of his understanding of Byzantine art. When he studied in Paris around 1915, his interest in Byzantine art had been echoed elsewhere in the scholars in Europe. Byzantine paintings were still understood to be inferior to Renaissance art, but some scholars and artists saw in the Byzantine tradition an alternative to outmoded Western concepts, including that of the Renaissance. Typical of this more innovative approach to Byzantium were the writings of the English art historian Roger Fry, who was heavily influenced by contemporary French scholarship. In 1912, he would write admiringly of the Giamatti enamels seen here. Now, these works are widely recognized as masterpieces of Middle Byzantine cloisonné enamel art. Fry noted, however, that they once would have been seen, quote, as barbaric products of naive craftsmen. Rejecting that opinion, he argued instead, as his medallion of the Virgin shows, that the images were, quote, pure design, whose lines of unrelenting certainty and art of drawing produced images which the greatest of modern masters might envy. Fry was equating the gold cloisons that divide the areas of enamel with drawing. To him, Byzantine art would be an alternative to the Renaissance and thus a source of inspiration for modern artists. He would go so far as to identify the works of Cézanne and Gauguin as, quote, proto-Byzantine. Nicozias, the Greek scholar who has most intensely studied Kondoglu, identified Gauguin as one of the influences on his early works. However, Fry's concept of Byzantium drove for modern art was not one that produced the spirituality that Kondoglu would seek. We have firmer evidence in Kondoglu's paintings and activities of his positive response to another aspect of Byzantine art that aroused increasing interest in his time. Excavations of the Roman era graves in Egypt had uncovered extensive numbers of portraits painted on wood, like that you see at the top of the sarcophagus on the screen. So many of these were uncovered at Fayum in Egypt that they still carry that name today. By 1931, when the first international Byzantine exhibition was organized in Paris, Fayum portraits were so accepted as a source of icon painting that a number were included in the exhibition, with icons dating to the 16th century. As in the modernist approach to Byzantium, the Paris exhibition ignored orthodoxy and spirituality. The exhibition showcased instead the exceptional quality of the arts of the empire, displaying them by media, ivory, gold, mosaic, painting, etc. The show was held under the patronage of the presidents of Greece and France. The painter Matisse was a member of the honorary organizing committee that included M. Papandreou, Greece's Minister of Public Education. Kondoglu must have been aware of the event and the widespread public enthusiasm for its contents. However, it's only the Fayum portraits that appear to have been influences on his art, and he would be sufficiently interested in the arts of Christian Egypt that soon after the Paris exhibition, he would become involved in the reinstallation of the Coptic Museum in Cairo. Another approach to Byzantium, popular in Kondoglu's era, was inspired by the writings of the mid-19th century Englishman John Ruskin. His Stones of Venice, with its appreciation of Byzantine and Gothic architectural elements of that city, was one of the most influential books in the world in his time. Translated into French, it had a profound impact on that country and on the development of interest in Byzantine art in Russia. It may be that Ruskin indirectly influenced Kondoglu because he certainly influenced the Russian icon painter and author Leonid Ouspensky, who in turn would be an influence on Kondoglu's approach to icon painting. You can see Ruskin's admiration for the Byzantine elements in Venice and this watercolor of the south end of San Marco by the Ducal Palace, where he's highlighted elements that were brought after the Fourth Crusade to the city, particularly the great gray column, elegantly carved, which is from Hagios Palaioktos, a church only rediscovered in Constantinople after Kondoglu's death. Kondoglu himself wrote that he was led to understand the greatness of Byzantine art in 1923 when he visited Mount Athos. His time at the Holy Monastery yielded sketches like this, very much in the same tradition of the watercolors of Ruskin, but he also made many copies of works there by a number of artists of generally the 16th century, and this is an image by Theophanes. Kondoglu would write, "I had not expected to find such perfect art in the monastery churches. From what I had read about Byzantine art, I had formed the idea that it was less worthy of attention than the art of the Italian Renaissance. But on Mount Athos, there were paintings of the most superb artistry. I approached these paintings with a feeling which arises from a cast of mind similar to that of the Byzantines and from a strict Christian upbringing." In his admiration for Theophanes and others of his generation on the Holy Mountain, Kondoglu was a precursor of the current intense scholarly interest in the traditions of the post-Byzantine era. However, his vision of Byzantine art, where Theophanes was a purely Byzantine painter, one whose spirituality challenged the naturalism of Renaissance art, is no longer widely accepted. Today's scholarship instead recognizes a debt to the Renaissance tradition in Theophanes' work, as documents we found over the last decade show how immensely involved Cretan painters were with the Venetian art market in the centuries in which that island was part of the city's empire. Thus, in conclusion, Theophanes' Virgin and Child on Mount Athos on the right can easily be seen to have been, on the left is Theophanes and on the right is Kondoglu, and you can see in the poses of the legs, the drapery, the calm and the monumentality, how one artist inspired the other. They are, in both of them, voices of Byzantium, but they're not the only voices of Byzantium. So what I hope you'll also recognize today is that in Kondoglu's era, there were multiple visions of Byzantium and multiple theories on how the arts of the empire related to his time. In his era, Kondoglu was a leader in recognizing and reviving the art of late and post-Byzantine painting, finding in it a spirituality that spoke to the truths of orthodoxy. In our time, the Mary Jaharis Center for Byzantine Art and Culture will be a leader in studying Byzantium and relating it to our era and to contemporary orthodoxy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans, for leading us so wonderfully into the theme of our Icon exhibition. I'd now like to call Dr. Ryan Preston. Dr. Ryan Preston holds a PhD in the study of religion from Harvard University, where he wrote a dissertation focusing on the intersection of art, religion, and national identity in the work of modern Greek icon painter Fotis Kondoglou. For 5 years, he taught at Arcadia University in Athens, Greece. Currently, he is adjunct professor in religion and art at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He is also engaged in research on the revival of Byzantine art in modern Greece and developing multiple courses in comparative sacred art amongst the world's religions. Dr. Preston will be speaking to us about the revival of Byzantine painting in the work of Fotis Kondoglou.
Your Eminences and members of the Jaharis family, thank you for the invitation to this wonderful event. The subject of my talk today is Kondoglou and the revival of Byzantine painting. My aim here will be to offer an introduction to Kondoglou's contribution to the revival of Byzantine style in contemporary Greek painting. Kondoglou was one of the first in modern times to call for a return to Byzantine painting, and without question, his influence would prove to be the most enduring. Indeed, it is because of Kondoglou's untiring support of the Byzantine tradition that churches in Greece today are once more painted in the traditional Byzantine style. Moreover, the Ekphrasis, his manual of icon painting, still serves as the standard reference for contemporary icon painters. But what was the situation before Kondoglou? The answer is that from the fall of Constantinople up until the time of Kondoglou, Greek church painting had increasingly fallen away from its Byzantine roots. When we look around the current exhibition here at the Jaharis Center, we will once recognize identifying features of Byzantine-style icon painting, namely portraits of saints rendered in a dramatically anti-naturalistic style. And this effect is largely achieved through techniques such as application of gold leaf to the background, the bronze-like quality of the figures, as well as flat relief, foreshortening, and other stylistic means. In recent times, Byzantine art has enjoyed a resurgence of interest as evidenced by the several well-received exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, in which the previous speaker, Dr. Helen Evans, played an instrumental role. However, Byzantine art was not always so appreciated. From the post-Byzantine period up until relatively recently, Byzantine art was seen by many as inferior to other forms of painting. Byzantine art had largely become associated with a medieval past that was considered to be obsolete or out of step with modern times. In response, an increasing number of painters began turning toward a more naturalistic style. Within the sphere of Greek church painting, one can still find evidence of this naturalism merely by strolling through the downtown Athens and visiting its neighborhood churches. In this example, although we still find iconic portraits of saints on the walls of churches, they tend to be rendered more naturalistically, as evidenced by the increased depth and volume in the folds of the clothing, as for example here, as well as here, and here in more detail. This naturalistic style derived from many sources, such as Venetian-influenced painting in Crete, the Ionian Islands, and parts of the Peloponnese. Perhaps the most pervasive influence, however, arrived via the so-called Nazarene school of painting, which within Greece was associated with the person of Ludwig Thiersch, a German painter who had taught at the School of Fine Arts in Athens. These examples of naturalism in Greek church painting were all part of the so-called Betterment or Veltiosi program, a program which came to see Byzantine style as both inferior and out of fashion, and therefore sought to improve it through the addition of depth, volume, shadowing, and other naturalistic features. To appreciate the significance of Kondoglou's revival, I believe it needs to be considered part of the aesthetic revolution that swept across much of Europe during the last part of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In hindsight, this aesthetic shift can be said to coincide and overlap with the emergence of modern art itself. Artists across Europe began consciously to reject the canons of naturalism that had been adopted since the Renaissance and taught in all the main art academies in Europe. At the same time, these artists began turning to various sources of traditional art: African, Japanese, Aztec. The list is quite long and came also to include early medieval Western art and, of course, Byzantine art. Many have seen this aesthetic shift as a conscious desire to regress, to go back, to seek a simpler and more spiritual approach to art. Accordingly, the shift was not seen in a negative light. On the contrary, what some might call progress, or indeed innovation, came to be seen as a break from tradition that evolved into a shallow decadence. This new generation of avant-garde artists sought to emulate the simplicity and immediacy held to be present in the cultures of traditional peoples, and to thereby avoid the perceived excesses of civilization by stripping away the layers of persona and paint to reveal a more profound and spiritual essence within. Kondoglu's rediscovery of Byzantine art may be viewed in this context. Like many of his contemporaries, early on in his career, Kondoglu had been preoccupied with many of the well-known movements of modern art. Above all, Expressionism, Symbolism, and Post-Impressionism. Van Gogh, Cézanne, Gauguin, he knew and studied them all and admired them at one time. However, in the early 1920s, there was a fairly abrupt shift in Kondoglu's artistic temperament, in which he now begins to turn away from these same sources, to gravitate back to his own native traditions, specifically Byzantine art and folk art, and most often the intersection of the two. Kondoglu's rediscovery of Byzantine and Greek folk art was in part inspired by a number of socio-political events, the most important of which was the 1922-23 war between Greece and Turkey, which ultimately led to the Asia Minor disaster and the exchange of populations between the two powers. Kondoglu was among the refugees from Asia Minor who became repatriated to the mainland, and to Athens more specifically. Upon arrival, many of these refugee communities had brought with them their heirlooms and works of Byzantine art. These same works would ultimately find their way into the collections of the Benaki and Byzantine museums, both of which opened their doors in the early 1930s. Kondoglu, however, agreed with Papadiamandis, of whom he was quite fond, that the revival of Byzantine art should not be confined exclusively to museums. Kondoglu held that to do so might imply that Byzantine art was simply a thing of the past, a mere relic, devoid of liturgical meaning and value. Instead, he campaigned tirelessly for a return to Byzantine art as a living tradition with relevance to modern times. To this end, he argued that, in fact, ecclesiastical painting had never suffered a complete break from its Byzantine past. To argue this position, Kondoglu pointed to the vitality of village life, what we might call popular or folk tradition, as the vehicle through which this transmission had been realized. Citing the many unsung and anonymous folk painters who had remained faithful to tradition, Kondoglu likened their activities to a natural phenomenon that develops organically over the course of time, despite the absence of a conventional state apparatus to lead and direct the tradition. This orientation toward popular culture and village life cannot be overestimated. It infuses the entirety of Kondoglu's work, and no study of his work can be considered complete without acknowledging its significance. It is also important to remember that Kondoglu's Byzantine revival was not confined to ecclesiastical painting, but included secular works as well. Indeed, Kondoglu was reluctant to see the two categories as separate or distinct. Indeed, if we look at some of his secular works, we can see the extent to which they evoke the spirit of ecclesiastical art. In many cases, the echoes are explicit, as in this example, The Vale of Tears, one of Kondoglu's earliest secular works. Here we can clearly see that the work is based upon the prototype of the 40 martyrs of Sevastia. By creating this work, Condoglou seems to have wanted to evoke the atmosphere of the Asia Minor catastrophe. The effect of the work, then, is to instantiate in the viewer's mind certain parallels between the two events, and perhaps to imply a cyclical understanding of history. Interestingly, moreover, Condoglou seems not to have seen the work as secular at all. When a representative from a well-known American periodical, The Atlantic, visited his home to solicit an example of Greek secular painting, Condoglou volunteered this work, but later confided to a friend, Constantin Cavernos, that he didn't really consider the painting to be a secular work at all. This is the prototype on which it's based. In a further example, this one from the City Hall in Athens, Condoglou once more evokes the spirit of Byzantine church painting with his representation of the Greek nation from its primeval origin up to present times. The figures are arranged here in the manner of saints, as they might appear on the wall of a church. And in fact, among the figures, we do find two saints, John Chrysostom and John of Damascus, although to be sure, none is depicted with a halo or the epithet agios, the conventional markers of sainthood. A third example of this interplay between sacred and secular reveals Condoglou at his most personal. Here on the walls of his home in Patisia, the artist employs the Byzantine style to portray some of his favorite scenes and figures from the stories he was exposed to during his early years in his native Aivaili. In Condoglou's home mural, we encounter the figures of Homer, Herodotus, Panselinos, and even Hellenized Egyptian and Turkish painters like Sutun and Bezat, mingling freely in the artist's imagination, together with a holy man from India and a wild man from Brazil. And in the midst of all of it, Condoglou has included himself together with his family. It is an intimate and playful work that reveals the depth and creativity of the artist. At the same time, it once more reaffirms his steadfast devotion to the Byzantine tradition. I think it is clear from the preceding slides that Condoglou conceived of his Byzantine revival as including both religious as well as secular painting. While the vast bulk of his works were indeed religious, throughout the course of his life, Condoglou would go on to produce numerous examples of secular painting, all of them rendered in the Byzantine style. Above all, I would argue Condoglou wished to make the case that the Byzantine heritage, in whatever sphere it may exist, deserved to be treated as a living tradition in modern times. It was a pleasure for me to be here today to speak about Condoglou, artist, writer, deep thinker, man of faith. Let us hope that he will continue to garner the attention he so rightfully deserves. Thank you very much.